First up, we're going to be talking about layer presence, something we also refer to as the Big Four. The Big Four, or layer presence, are incredibly important properties that you need to determine for each layer, as it is the primary driving force behind where your content is going to appear within your project and which screen objects it's rendering to. Let's jump in. All right, so let's take a look at this project that I've made here, which is available for you in the video description. So if we look at our 4 layers here, which are each showing up on these 4 screen objects that I've made in the Screens tab, we can click on the layer and then navigate to the inspector and go to Layer Setup. And in here, we've got this parameter group called Presence. This is the layer presence, or what we refer to as the Big Four properties of each layer: the home screen, scale unit mode, origin, and screen group presence. We're going to go over each one of these individually, as they each do something very specific to the layer, and we want to look at how those are affected individually before we put it all together and try to utilize them all with each other. All right, so let's jump over to the home screen timeline, where we can look at how a layer is affected by its home screen property in layer presence. I've just started this timeline, and each of these clips is running in free loop mode just so we can see what's happening. If I click on the layer and again navigate over to the inspector, we can see I've got this home screen A. And if I click on this drop down, we can see all of my various screen objects here, not only the ones that I may be looking at, but anything in the project. And quite simply, if I take this home screen and I change it to home screen B, then we'll see this layer appear on home screen B. So let's look at that. And I could do that again and go to home screen C. Or I could go to home screen D. And we'll go back to home screen A. Now, what's cool about this is if I twirl down my clip properties here and look at my position values, I'm not changing those position values at all. I'm just changing where my layer is, quote unquote, starting its render journey. So home screen B, home screen C, home screen D, and we can see these labels here. I've just turned this label tool on. Now I can do that with any of the layers here. So I could grab main B and I could put that on a different home screen. I could take main C, put that over on main B, right? So in this way, we can change home screens up really easily and change up our programming without actually moving anything around. Another quick way to alter the home screen is I can actually take a layer and just click and drag it onto a screen, and that's going to change its home screen as I click and drag it around. So pretty easily, I could change all of these screen objects or all of these layers so that they render on a different home screen without actually doing any sort of movement at all. One other thing I want to talk about with home screens is that if I were to take this piece of content here and let's just make it really big, I have this render only on home screen button. And so if I click on that, then now I'm only rendering this content on the home screen, even though it's much bigger. Notice I still have some dominant values here. I'm going to go ahead and hit S to save those. But now, as I change my home screen, we'll see that the content actually moves around with it, but we're still only rendering on that one screen. Later, we're going to see how we can use this in combination with something like Origin so that the same piece of content is revealed on multiple screens. One other thing to notice with our home screen here is that if I were to add in a little bit of movement on these, so let's take this render on home screen off, and I'm just going to move it from here, and we'll add another keyframe and go over here. We can see that if I move that, right, we get that pan across home screen D, but let's move this back to A, and now we can see we get that same movement. It's just centered on a different place, a different home screen. So just an interesting way you can use home screens and position values to maybe save yourself some programming time. All right, so let's move from home screens over to our next demo, which is up here with this scale unit mode content A, B, C, and D. So if I go to my scale unit mode simple timeline and hit play, and I'll go ahead and pause it, not a lot of difference between each of these screens. So let's go examine what's going on in our layer presence. I've got 4 different layers here. And if I click on one, we can see that this first one is associated with content A, B, C, and D. Each of these is the same size, so essentially these are the same surface. But we've changed our scale unit mode. So we have a fit, a fill, a stretch, and a resource resolution. On a piece of content that's 1920 by 1080 or 16 by 9, each of these looks basically the same when we are using a standard 16 by 9 aspect ratio screen object. The fit, fill, stretch, and resource resolution don't really do much, so the scale unit mode may not matter if that's all you're working with. But let's jump ahead to this 3840 by 1080 content, and we'll see an immediate difference. Already we can see on our fit home screen, we've maintained the aspect ratio, but we have shrunken our content so that it fits within the bounds of our screen object. If we go to our fill home screen, we can see that our content has made itself bigger and is actually bleeding into the perspective of our sum content A screen object here. If we go look at the size values here, we can see that in our fit home screen, we're on 1920 by 540, whereas our fill is at 3840 by 1080, because this 1080 size of our screen object is what's determining how large that piece of content needs to get. Let's go down even further to the stretch, where we will break aspect ratio in order to stretch the content to the whole screen object. So in this case, we've got 1920 by 1080. And in my size, we can see that's 1920 by 1080. And so we've smushed our content to fit within the bounds here. We don't get the letterboxing that you would get on a fit to home screen. And lastly, we've got our resource resolution, and you'll notice that the 2 screens here look very similar, and that's because the resource resolution, which is 3840 by 1080, is the exact same as what you would get in that fill home screen. And let's go look at one last example here, the 1280 by 720. Here we see almost the exact same. However, in our resource resolution, our size is now 1280 by 720, which is not large enough to fit the 1920 by 1080 screen object. Okay, so that's scale unit modes when we're taking the same piece of content and looking at how it looks on the same type of screen while changing only the scale unit mode. Again, our home screen here is changing, but it's only changing so that way we can see them all at the same time. If we move down a little bit, we can look at this SUM scale unit mode and info screen. And here I'll navigate to my scale unit mode advanced info. And if I hit play here, I've set up each of these timelines so that we're getting the same piece of content 4 different times on 4 different screens, each one a different aspect ratio. And you can see in the middle here what we're actually seeing in terms of what the scale unit mode is set to for each of these. So now we're looking at this 3840 by 1080 with a fill home screen and now a stretch home screen and resource resolution. And then we're moving over to our last piece of content, which is 1280 by 720. And we're looking at how each of these reacts with different scale unit modes. Now I'm going to group select all these so we can examine them a little more closely, and I'll go ahead and hit the pause button here. So in this standard 1920 by 1080 content, we can look at our different screens here and see that in our scale unit mode B here, even though we're on fill home screen, this is 3840 by 1080. And so we're actually cutting off the top and bottom of our content. And this is where we can go look at our intercompositing to see exactly what's happening here. So I can go select sum B, scale unit mode advanced, and let's dive in. And we can see our content outside of the bounds of the screen here. And I could jump to different screen groups in order to see how those pieces of content are reacting to the perspectives that are being shown there. All right, let's go ahead and hit play again. And let's see. Let's get to the 3840 by 1080, because I think some really interesting stuff happens here. So in the fit home screen, we can see we get lots of pillar boxing and letter boxing, mainly letter boxing, with our 3840 by 1080 content. If we go to our stretch, we can really start to see our aspect ratios being broken on this 1080 by 1920 or this 1920 by 1080, where we've compressed the content quite significantly. And lastly, this 1280 by 720 looks almost the same as our 1920 by 1080, but there's one important difference, especially when we get to our resource resolution, where it's now smaller than almost everything, except it actually fits our 1280 by 720 screen perfectly. Now, something that we can do with scale unit mode is we can click on a layer and change it over here, obviously, but you can also right click on the layer heading and change the scale unit mode of any layer right here. All right, so the next layer presence setting we're going to look at is layer origin. And to do that, I'm just going to scroll over a little bit in my workspace here to these two screens, one of which I've labeled home screen origin and one I've labeled absolute origin. Let's jump to the origin timeline I've created. And I've got two layers here, one home screen origin. And if I click on that and go look at my layer presence, we can see that my origin is set to home screen. I also have its home screen set to home screen origin. Let's hit play and see what that looks like here. So we can see that our content shows up on the home screen origin screen. And if we look at our position settings, we're at 0, 0. So if we move this screen around, we would assume that the content would stick with this screen object. So let's go check that out. If we go back to the screens tab, and I'm going to move this just up 2 meters. Let's go back to compositing. And we can see the content has actually moved with it. So we change no position values here, but our perspective, which we've already talked about, has stuck with the screen object itself and is moving the origin with it. So the content moves with the screen. And indeed, if I move this back down, we'll see it, the content moves with it. Let's check out the other layer here, absolute origin, which has a different home screen, the absolute origin home screen, and also has the origin of absolute. So I'm going to just click to here in the timeline. Now, if we move this screen object around, we would expect the content to stay at the origin. And we can see in its position data, this 0, 0 point here, that the content will indeed stick to here. Let's watch that in action. If I move the screen up, say, 4 meters, our content is no longer on our screen object because it is still at the 0, 0 point of our world space. If we want, we could actually dive in to that screen object. And if we zoom out, we can see our absolute origin perspective here. And if we go down just a little bit, there's our content. Now, there's a couple of ways we could do some programming to get the content to appear on the absolute origin. The first thing we could do is I could go to layers and compositing, or again, I could hit F4, and I can grab this layer, and using my snapping, I'm just going to bring it up to my origin point here, or to my origin perspective. And if I jump out, we can now see that there's that content. So we can now see that this content appears on our absolute origin perspective. And our position value is at 3,479 units here. So let's take a look at what happens if I store this keyframe here. And now I'm going to move my screen back to the absolute origin. So -4. We're at 0, 0 on my screen object. In compositing, once again, our content has disappeared on our screen object because, and we can dive in again to see this, our content remains up here. If I were to delete this keyframe, we can see it snaps back to its 0, 0 and back to absolute origin. So next, I have this clip set up with these cue points here to demonstrate some movement on the home screen origin layer. And if I move this screen around, we can see that this content remains moving with it. If we jump to this absolute origin set of movement here, and I move this screen around, we see that our content has disappeared. So what could we do if our origin is set to absolute, but we want to see our content here without actually changing any of our keyframes? For that, we're going to jump to our next feature, which relates to layer presence, called layer offsets. Layer offsets can be found in the layer inspector below presence in a parameter group called offsets. And these values for position, rotation, and scale will offset the layer values by whatever numbers you have in here. So for example, I could take this position offset at Y and I can move it up until we could see it in my absolute origin screen. I could take it and move it up a little more so that I could see it in my home screen origin. All we've done here is offset this position value of 0 with some value that we've put in here. And a reminder that because this option is found in the layer setup inspector, that means that these offsets will apply to the whole layer. Another great use case of this is I could apply a quarter scaling to the whole layer so that every piece of content will appear at a quarter scale, or maybe will appear always in the top right corner. And let's move away from this moving one back to our regular one. And so I can move this a little bit so that this piece of content always appear, any piece of content I put on this layer will always appear in the top right corner of the screen. We could see that in action if I just scroll out a little bit. And let's go drop a different piece of content onto that layer. If I bring it over here, we can see it falls in the exact same place. A thing to notice here is that our scale unit modes will still apply. So this piece of content is 1920 by 1080, whereas our other piece of content here is 1280 by 720. If we changed our scale unit mode to be resolution, then this 1280 by 720 piece of content would change sizes from the 1920 by 1080 piece of content, while still applying our position, rotation, and scale offsets. So I've restored some of my parameters here. I've moved my screen object back to the origin and changed my scale unit mode back because I want to demonstrate one other thing we can do with offsets, which is this store current button. If I were to move my absolute origin up 2 meters again, I could dive in here and making sure that I'm in selection mode layers, I can click on this content and using my snapping, I'm going to just move this up and I'm going to scale down a little bit. And I'm going to just place this right here, similar to the position I had before. And then we have this store current button. So I can actually click on this and it will store the current values that I have loaded into the parameters into these offsets. And it will then ask me if I can do just a store current, or I can do store current and reset, which will release any dominant values. I can store current and remove keys that are on my, any keyframes that are on my clip, or I can store current and reset and remove keys, which will release any dominant values and then remove any keyframes. So let's look at that in action. I'm going to just store the current values. Now, when I do this, my content immediately pops up to here. We can see that on that layer, we've stored those values into the position, but we haven't actually released these values yet. And the reason for that is because I still have these size parameters that I want to make sure I get stored into my scaling. So I'm going to click on this. And in this case, I'm going to say store current and reset. That should keep this content this size and move it to that position that I had earlier. Let's check it out. There we go. So my position values are now 0, 0. I have a size value that is 1920 by 1080, even though I have a scaling factor applied in my offsets. And my position values have changed to reflect the new position offsets. If we go over to our next clip, we can see that our position and scale offsets have applied despite having a keyframe movement here. I'm going to pause the timeline and move this maybe down to the bottom right. And in this case, I'm going to do the store current and reset and remove keys. This will remove these keyframes and keep our content in this position. There we go. So we've removed keyframes. Our position values are at 0, 0. Our size reflects the size that we have with our scaling factor, or before our scaling factor. And our content is in the position that we want it in. The final layer presence setting is screen group presence. And in order to understand screen group presence, we first need to understand what a screen group is. So let's go explore that by just dragging our workspace over to this screen setup with Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta. And let's go to our screen groups timeline. So what is a screen group? Well, a screen group is a collection of screen perspectives, and perspectives are associated with some screen object. And we can use those perspectives in multiple screen groups to create different compositing relationships. So, for example, we can use something like we see in the screen group tab here with our normal, duplicate, and contiguous screen groups to have 3 different perspective layouts for the same set of screen objects here. So let's take a look at that. Screen groups are a form of building block in PIXERA, so they're in our library panel in this screen groups tab. In order to create screen groups, we can use this plus button here, or we can right click on a screen group that's already created and hit duplicate. We can click on a screen group and rename this. So I could call this one test SG. There's information in here. We have a display color. I'll show you what that associates with in a moment. This perspective mode is something that's really important, but is more of an advanced topic. 3D perspective modes have to do with things like virtual production, or if you're trying to set up any sort of parallaxing effects with something like 2.5D workflows. The reference screen is what the screen group is going to use as its base screen when doing any sort of math to do its pixel density calculations. If you had two LED screens that were different sizes in pixel pitch, you could use this reference screen so that the content would show up the same on both of those screen objects without having to do any additional programming. If you want to make that so all resolutions are just whatever their screen object is, you can do this Frustum size depends on resolution. If we have a screen group, we can always go over here and I can right click in here to add or remove screens from a screen group. One thing I want you to note is that every screen object, and we can see every screen object in this list here, has to be in at least one screen group. So by default, any screen you bring in to the screens tab is going to populate somewhere in a screen object. You can specify what that is in the initial values, which is something we'll talk about at the end of this video. Every screen object must be in at least one screen group. So you can't have a screen that is not in at least one. So a screen can be in multiple screen groups, but it has to be in at least one. When we're talking about what is in a screen group, if we twirl this down, let's start with the normal screen group normal here, which is my first layer on this screen groups timeline. And I'm going to jump forward a little bit. And in this normal, if we click on the layer, we can look in the setup and see our screen group presence is in screen group normal. And I could click here and see a drop down of all the screen groups that all the screen groups in my screen group panel. Looking at this normal layer and this screen group normal screen group, we can see that we've got some content missing in the gutters here. So the X is missing. There's some of the P is missing here. Some of our triangle is missing. Let's go look at how these perspectives are set up in our inner compositing space. So in order to do that, we have these two drop downs here. This one on the left is going to let me pick my screen. And so I'm going to want to be on screen alpha. And I can select the screen group in this right drop down. And I want to be in screen group normal. And then I'll hit the D key to dive in. And so we can see there's our missing content. Here's our screen groups. If I go to this screen group normal, its display color is red. Here's where that color shows up. And the way I got that to show up is in the workspace toolbar. There's this screen display, which is either set to none. There's some other options here, but then there's groups, which will show you the screen group. So I could change this to something like this blue, and that'll change. So these perspectives, and I can hit F4 to get to my perspective selection mode. We can see where these perspectives are set up. They correspond with our perspectives here. And we can actually look at where they are in compositing space in the inspector. We could reset that perspective if we needed to. This is some of what we talked about in the last video with inner and outer compositing. So that's our normal screen group. Let's jump to our duplicate screen group. We see that our workspace here no longer has any content in it. So what's happened? Well, what's happened is in this inner compositing space, we are no longer in the correct screen group. If we go to duplicate, we can see the screen group presence here is screen group duplicate. So if I go to here and twirl this down, now we see some content. If I were to go to this screen group, where is it? Duplicate, there it is. We can see that Alpha, Charlie, Bravo, and Delta are part of both of these screen groups. So it's possible to have multiple screens in multiple screen groups. Let's jump to outer compositing. And we can see that we are now looking at the same thing on 4 different screen objects. What's really cool about this and why this is really helpful in programming is we've only had to program this once on the timeline. So if I go and make sure that I'm in my layers and compositing selection mode, I can actually move this content around only once, and it will affect the programming on all of these screen objects. The other nice thing about this is because it's only on the timeline once, we've actually only rendered it one time. So we're more performant, and we're actually saving performance when we are worried about some of our system performance here. Okay, let's jump to our last one, and I'm going to select contiguous first, and we're going to go look at the layer setup. And this screen group presence on this layer is in screen group contiguous. I'll twirl this down, make sure we've got all of the right screens in here. And if I jump forward, now we can see, and I've got a freeze frame here, that X isn't missing anymore. So if I select that contiguous screen group and dive in, that screen group, let's change that color so that way we're not confusing ourselves with the other one. We can see that there's no more gutters there. So we've actually changed the perspectives to all lock into each other and no longer have the gutters. And we can play this timeline, and you can see that we can switch between screen groups based on what the screen group presence of the layer is. So if you have a setup with a concert and there are different LED layouts for different shows, you would be able to duplicate your screen groups and set things up differently if you needed to. All right, so we've talked about inner and outer compositing, screen perspectives, layer presence, home screen, scale unit mode, origin, and screen group presence. Let's talk about a couple of things that may happen as you start to change these things as you're programming your show. I have a simple setup here with a couple of layers and a couple of screen objects. And let's say that we have decided in this moment, something's happened in the show, and we've decided that we want to take these 2 IMAG screen perspectives, and instead of grabbing these individual clips here, we're actually going to change the perspective so that way they grab this center screen here, or at least the center part of the center screen. So that way we're not having to deal with any sort of reprogramming on our show. So the way I could do that is I could dive into center where all of my screen groups are, and I could take my perspective here, making sure that I'm in screen selection mode perspectives, and I could grab this IMAG stage left and start to move it onto my center. And we get this large pop-up dialog here. So this says you are moving this perspective away from its default position. Layers that use this perspective as their origin will move along with it in compositing space. PIXERA can set those layers' origins to absolute and adapt their offsets so that the current compositing relationships are maintained. And then it gives you 3 options of what you would like to do here. 9 times out of 10, you're going to choose change origins to absolute and adapt layer offsets. And what this is going to do is, and I'm going to press it here, this is going to change any layer that has IMAG stage left as its home screen. So this layer here, if we go to presence, there's that home screen. It's changed the origin to absolute. And in my offsets, we can see that we've actually adapted some offsets there. So then I can drag this over to here. And now I can center on this screen so that we're not needing to change any other programming. Let's look at the IMAG stage right. We have in our layer presence a home screen with IMAG stage right. Origin is home screen. So if we try to move this, we'll get the same dialog box. So we get the same options here. If I want, I could just change origins to absolute, which will move this content from here in compositing space down to the origin, which is hidden behind this dialog box here. So let's try that. So we've moved the content a little bit, but now I can freely move this perspective around. Let's look at something else going on with our screen group here. If we look, we can see that our IMAG stage right and stage left are set at 1920 by 1080, but our center screen is a really large perspective in terms of pixel space, even though if we dive out, our texture is only 1920 by 1080. Let's jump in again and let's go to our screen group. And here we can start to look at some of these settings here. Now, the reference screen of my screen group is IMAG stage right 1920 by 1080. This means that the pixel density of all of these screen objects is going to be calculated from this IMAG stage right screen based on its size in the Screens tab. If we were to change this to center, we can see a lot's happened here. In fact, it looks like our center perspective has changed pretty substantially, and our IMAG screens have gotten a lot smaller. This is where this Frustum size depends on resolution becomes really helpful. If I click on this, all of my perspectives are now 1920 by 1080. You could even use this maintain closest corner and Frustum position and logical raster to line these things up a little bit better so that the corners are close and that the perspectives are attempting to align themselves with each other. One final option we have when dealing with layer presence is we can go to the settings and to initial values, timelines, and we can set up what the defaults of our layers are going to be. So I could say I want all of my layers to have their origin be absolute. I want them to always start as resource resolution. So if you have a layer or a project where every layer wants to start with a specific set of parameters, this is where you can set that. That way your defaults will always be set to the right thing for your big four.